Hello and welcome to Sticky Notes, the classical music podcast. My name is Joshua Weilerstein. I'm a conductor, and I'm the music director of the Orchestre Nationale de Lille and the chief conductor of the Aalborg Symphony. This podcast is for anyone who loves classical music, works in the field, or is just getting ready to dive into this amazing world of incredible music. Before we get started, I want to thank all of my Patreon sponsors for making Season 10 possible. If you'd like to support the show, please head over to patreon.com/StickyNotesPodcast. And if you are a fan of the show, please take a moment to give us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It is greatly appreciated. I am recording this episode quite early because I'm about to head to Lille for a couple of weeks of concerts with the Orchestre Nationale de Lille to open our season. We're going to be doing two programs that are centered around Ravel. We're doing both of Ravel's piano concertos, the Piano Concerto in G and the Concerto for the Left Hand, and then some more curious pieces that are connected to Ravel in different ways. We're doing a beautiful arrangement of Rimsky-Korsakov's Antar, which was done partly by Ravel. We're also going to do Germaine Taillefer's Petite Suite, Little Suite, for orchestra. Taillefer was connected through many different circles to Ravel. We will also be doing Ravel's Bolero as well, because you can't have a concert with Ravel without doing Bolero, apparently. But of course, the truth is, as a conductor, I always have adored Bolero, which I know makes me a little bit in the minority in terms of musicians, but I find Bolero absolutely fascinating and intoxicating, so I never complain about doing Bolero, and I think we're doing it 6 times in the next couple of weeks, so I'll have a lot of chance to get to have some fun with it. And we will also be doing some Duke Ellington, Harlem, some Leonard Bernstein, the On the Town dances, and Stravinsky's Firebird, so tons of really great repertoire that I'm really looking forward to exploring with the orchestra. For today's episode, I've got another Patreon-sponsored episode, this time by Glenn, who asked me to do an episode on the Barber Violin Concerto, one of my absolute favorite pieces, a piece I played throughout my violin playing years, and a piece that I think is very underrated, and a piece that has a story attached to it that actually, through researching this podcast, I learned is completely wrong, and we're going to get into that in great detail when we start the show. So thanks again to Glenn for sponsoring this episode on Patreon, and I really hope you enjoy this episode on the wonderful Barber Violin Concerto. There are so many great apocryphal stories in the long history of classical music. From the reason Tchaikovsky wrote his Sixth Symphony, to what famous composers said on their deathbeds, to really my favorite story, which is how the 96th Symphony of Joseph Haydn, the Miracle Symphony, got its name. Apparently, a chandelier fell during the premiere of the symphony, but it, miraculously, didn't hit anyone, hence the Miracle Symphony. The chandelier did actually fall, but we now know that it fell during the premiere of Haydn's 102nd Symphony, which does not currently have a nickname. Coincidentally, or not so coincidentally, the 96th Symphony gets played a lot more than the 102nd, not because of its quality, but because of its nickname, even though it's the nickname of the wrong symphony. The Barber Violin Concerto actually has a great and true story about it. But before this information was revealed in 2010, the story of the concerto's conception was completely different and extremely false. The original story goes that Barber had completed the first 2 movements of his violin concerto and sent them along to the soloist who was going to play the premiere, Briselli. It includes moments like this. Briselli didn't like the concerto, according to the story, saying that it wasn't virtuosic enough, so he told Barber to write him something more difficult for the last movement. Barber, perhaps laughing in some sort of evil way, came back with the third movement, which starts like this and then never lets up. When Barber sent back the third movement, Briselli apparently realized he couldn't play the movement because of its difficulty, and so he was unable to play the premiere, which went to the violinist Albert Spalding instead. It's a great Icarus flying too close to the sun classical music story. But the truth is, it's not true at all. In 2010, letters were released between Barber, Briselli, and one of the other main characters in this little operetta, Briselli's violin teacher, Albert Meif. I'll get into the whole story later, but it's a really good one, even if it's not quite as cinematic as the legend. More important than the dispute over its last movement and its conception is the remarkable beauty and creativity of this masterful 20th century violin concerto. Barber's Violin Concerto, as I said in the introduction, is one of my favorite pieces to play and to conduct, and it has charmed audiences ever since it was first performed. It features Americana music, the likes of which only Copland could equal, as well as a heartbreaking oboe solo that might be one of the greatest moments in the history of American classical music. And then there's that pesky third movement, a challenge to every violinist and orchestra, and a movement that is controversial for many reasons. We're going to get into all of this today on this Patreon-sponsored episode, coming right up on Sticky Notes. So, what's the real story of the genesis of this concerto? It's a fun story, and bonus, it figures into the musical content as well, so I don't feel too guilty giving you the whole long version, though I'll be sprinkling other parts of the story in as we start to talk about the music. The quick and simple version is that Barber was commissioned to write a violin concerto by Samuel Fels, the president of the soap manufacturing company Fels & Co. Fels & Co. was extremely successful, and so Fels was able to personally offer Barber $1,000 to write the piece, which is the equivalent of almost $24,000 today, which is a pretty high fee for a composer even these days. The concerto was going to be written for Iso Briselli, who has a fascinating story in his own right. Briselli, born Isaac Briselli, was born in Odessa, Ukraine. He studied at the same institution that had produced violinists such as David Oistrakh and Nathan Milstein. Born to a Jewish family, Briselli's parents experienced heavy discrimination following the Russian Revolution and escaped to Germany, where Briselli was encouraged to change his name from the very Jewish-sounding Isaac to Iso. When the Curtis Institute of Music was founded in 1924, Briselli followed his teacher Karl Flesch to Philadelphia, where he was to be cared for, since he was only 12 years old, by the Fels family. Many years later, Fels commissioned Barber to write a concerto for his surrogate son, Briselli. I should mention that almost all of this information came from the wonderful website isobriselli.com, and this article was written by Mark Mostovoy. Barber said that he would be happy to write a piece of about 15 minutes in length for Briselli, but Fels, considering the amount of money he was shelling out for the piece, asked for it to be a bit longer, more like the other concerti Briselli had in his repertoire. Barber agreed, and things seemed to be moving forward. In the meantime, Arturo Toscanini's performance of Barber's Adagio for strings on national radio had made Barber a household name in the US, and the Fels commission advance allowed Barber and his partner, the Italian composer Giancarlo Menotti, to travel to Europe for a while. Barber planned to have a couple of months to write the concerto while in Switzerland. The problem is that Barber and Menotti couldn't have chosen a worse time to take their vacation, the summer of 1939. Barber and Menotti were able to get back to the US by the fall, and in the meantime, Barber had finished the first two movements of the concerto. Barber sent the manuscript to Briselli, who, contrary to the famous story, was thrilled with what he found. he enthusiastically wrote to Barber that he loved the music and was awaiting the finale. In his letter back, he did make a suggestion to Barber that the third movement could be more virtuosic. And here's where the wheels fell off the tracks. Enter Albert Meif, who took one look at the first two movements of the concerto and dismissed them as unviolinistic and unsatisfying. Meif was Iso Briselli's violin mentor at the time. In 2010, a trove of letters was uncovered, so we actually know what Meif's specific objections were to the concerto. Meif wrote, quote, "Iso came up unexpectedly yesterday with a serious problem. He brought a manuscript, a concertino for violin by Mr. Samuel Barber, a new composition possibly written for a special occasion. The composition possesses beautiful romantic moods, many somber and quite interesting parts typical of that composer. In any event, very interesting. However, it bears a serious defect. It is not a composition gratifying for a violinist to perform. The technical embellishments are very far from the requirements of a modern violinist. And this statement is very mild, because some of the parts are childish in details, again from a violinist's standpoint. With all my respect to the composer's talent, I am convinced Iso is undertaking great risk to perform it in its present form." Meif rightly points out later that many composers worked directly with violinists on their concerti, from Brahms to Tchaikovsky, but he also claims that he himself will do a, quote, surgical operation on the first two movements in order to fix all of the problems. Then Barber sent the third movement, and things got even more confused and complicated. Briselli didn't think the third movement was too difficult, but he also didn't really like it. He echoed criticism that still sticks about the movement, that it didn't make sense in relation to the first two movements, and was much less substantial in musical character. Briselli asked Barber to rewrite the last movement, but Barber steadfastly refused. Briselli felt he couldn't make the performance work, and so relinquished the rights to the concerto. Barber himself said, quote, "I could not destroy a movement in which I have complete confidence, out of artistic sincerity to myself. So we decided to abandon the project with no hard feelings on either side." Briselli and Barber remained friends for the rest of their lives. The myth about Briselli finding the third movement too difficult came from the first and for a long time only biography of Barber, and for some reason neither Barber or Briselli ever made a strenuous effort to correct the record, so we had to wait until 2010 for Barbara Hayman's new biography to set the record straight. Okay, I know that was a long story, but I think it's a good one, and it really gets you into the nuts and bolts of how pieces come to be. Let's go into the music now. The concerto opens with the violin coming in right away, playing a gorgeous and thoroughly American melody, simple, graceful, with a long line and passion lurking beneath the surface. Now, Meif's letter is rough, acerbic, and often incorrect, but he is correct about one thing. In that letter, he wrote, quote, "The beginning is more like a sonata in a register that again would not fit in a big hall." This is a problem throughout the first movement, as Barber often writes for the violin to play in the middle register of the instrument, which is, admittedly, very hard to project into the large concert halls that this concerto is usually played in. The orchestra and the conductor have to be very conscious of this issue and have to play very transparently to make the violin solo line audible in the hall. But Meif really does misunderstand one thing about the piece, and that is that Barber is clearly not trying to write a big romantic concerto in the guise of Brahms or Tchaikovsky or Sibelius. This is a more understated concerto in many ways, fitting with Barber's normal aesthetic. Remember that Barber originally conceived of the piece as a shorter 15-minute work, more like a concertino than a big concerto. And that brings us to the way that this concerto is performed. Very often, soloists bring a big, juicy, romantic tone to this music, which can work, but I think it misunderstands the nature of this music. We'll get more into this in the second movement. But for now, Barber repeats his opening theme, but in this case, the violin repeats a series of halting phrases over mysterious harmonies, before scampering up into the stratosphere, as the second theme emerges in the woodwinds. And for this show, I'm using a recording with Joshua Bell playing the violin part, with Alan Gilbert conducting the Berlin Philharmonic. The violin re-enters with a fantasy on this theme, almost like an improvisation, as the music remains shrouded in mystery, until the orchestra again comes in with a gorgeous version of the opening theme. Orchestras generally really love playing this concerto, as it offers them plenty of opportunities to let loose. We still haven't had a hint of a typical concerto here, until finally the violin comes in with a new energy, completely transforming the beautiful theme into something sparkling with possibility. This is the first truly virtuosic music in the movement, and Barber doesn't hold back, sending us flying into the development section of this sonata form movement with the first major outburst of the piece. As a violinist, I can't tell you how many times I practiced the scales that conclude this clip I'll play for you now. Funnily enough, those scales often have a lot of trouble projecting into a concert hall over the orchestra. So unless the conductor and orchestra are quite careful, all that work can go to waste. We have arrived now at the development section, and all of the peaceful Americana music of the opening has been thrust aside for a terrifying and violent version of the main theme. I've sometimes wondered how a composer could write such peaceful music, like the opening of the piece, in the summer of 1939, with the clouds of war gathering over Europe. But then again, this passionate music here becomes more and more present as the movement goes on, threatening the peaceful mood all the time. Finally, this music collapses, and a more nervous and uncertain version of the second theme is heard. This is all setting the stage for the violin's re-entry, in their lowest register, shrouded in mystery. It's not wrong to say that a typical violin concerto might take some of these beautiful melodies and add virtuosic passage work to them. But this is actually another thing I love about this concerto. The violinist, in a way, can't hide behind pyrotechnics. Instead, they must find a way to express these beautiful and exposed melodies in an emotionally vulnerable way. There's no macho virtuosity here. It's all subtle, tender, and expressive. In fact, some of the melodies are so simple and unadorned that they remind me of Mozart, straight at the core of the music itself. We seem to be arriving at another emotional outburst, but instead in one of the most magical moments of the concerto, Barber changes course. The violin for the moment remains low in its register, while an angelic flute floats in, and the violin, seemingly inspired, brings us not to music of uncertainty, but to music of a kind of desperate ecstasy, as if it is reaching for something more and more, knowing that it will get there in the end. The brass play a fanfare on the second theme, and the music takes on a heroic character, as if proclaiming victory over the struggles of before. But that's not all. At the climactic moment, the violinist takes us with wild abandon to the recapitulation, a glorious moment for the orchestra, singing out the main theme in one of the most emotionally satisfying moments of the whole piece. The recapitulation is quite similar to the exposition, and this takes us to the cadenza section. It's interesting in light of the fact that Barber was not trying to write a big romantic concerto, that he ended up following the form of a big romantic concerto pretty much to the letter. Sonata form first movement, including a cadenza, or solo section for the violin, a slow movement, and a fast last movement. In Barber's case, though, just like in the rest of the movement, everything is more compact in content and concise than in the big famous romantic concerti. The first movement is only 11 minutes long, in comparison to the over 20-minute long first movements of the Brahms and Beethoven violin concertos. The cadenza is also quite compact, but it brings us back to the more violent character of the opening of the development section. It's as if Barber is continuously trying to escape from this darker music, but can never quite get away, no matter how much he tries. And in an interesting twist, what emerges as the cadenza comes to an end is not the opening theme, but the second theme, uncertain again, as if poking its head above the parapet. But in a beautiful twist, the violin finally takes on this second theme for the first time alone, gently ushering the movement to a close. Despite all the trappings of a romantic concerto, this is not that. It is a much more modest movement, but one that is not any less beautiful for it. The second movement might be, without any exaggeration on my part, my favorite violin concerto slow movement. Yes, more than Brahms or Tchaikovsky or Beethoven, though maybe not more than the Sibelius Violin Concerto slow movement. The second movement of the Barber Violin Concerto is a movement of immense yearning, featuring an oboe solo that certainly rivals the oboe solo in Brahms's Violin Concerto in its beauty. The great violinist Pablo de Sarasate famously refused to play the Brahms Violin Concerto, saying, quote, "Why should I stand there while the oboe gets the best melody in the piece?" Sarasate was a great virtuoso who reveled in the technical ability of the violin. But as I've been saying all along today, Barber was going for something different. And that was to create a concerto which was a great piece of music first, then a concerto to display the violinist's abilities. So I can't think of a better instrument to play this gorgeous and heartbreaking theme than the oboe. And don't worry, later on the violin will get to play it too. Something about this theme is so profoundly touching. It's hard to put a finger on it, and I imagine everyone hears it in a different way. But for me, I hear a kind of yearning that I mentioned before, along with something like nostalgia. Whatever the inspiration or mood that Barber intended, it is the kind of music that changes the atmosphere in the hall as soon as it starts. As the oboe theme ends, the cellos take over the tune and then soon pass it to the clarinets. This extended opening introduction is nearly 3 minutes long, and the violin still has not entered. and over a deeply ambiguous yet expectant chord, the violin enters. Barber tells the violinist to play without hurrying, as they seem to be constructing a new theme out of thin air. Slowly the violin ascends into the upper reaches of the instrument, and instead of calming the orchestra as it did so many times in the first movement, the violinist is the one who wrenches us out of this mood of yearning and into struggle and despair. Fanfares from the brass punctuate these plunging lines from the violinist. The violinist seems to take no interest in what the oboe has done, and instead brings us to the most hard-edged and turbulent music of the entire piece so far. What follows is an extended fantasy, with the mood rapidly changing between lyrical mystery to agonized wailing. Finally, we reach stasis, as if this outburst from the violin cannot be sustained. Instead, we are left in an uneasy stillness. Once again, we have the impression that Barber wants something, but is unable or unwilling to push it over the line. But in the end, we will get there. After a quietly passionate struggle, we have finally set the stage for the violin to take on the main theme that the oboe presented it so long ago. But the violin version is more passionate than the oboe version, though I still always advocate for a slightly understated kind of passion, something that is hard to achieve in music that is this emotional. For me, American music is like how Copland describes it, with strong emotions, but these emotions are slightly under the surface. To me, if you play it like that, it creates even more depth than if you play it in a kind of heart-on-sleeve romanticism. But finally, we do get a taste of that heart-on-sleeve as the violin reaches up into the clouds in order to bring the orchestra along for a soaring version of the main theme. The intensity here seems to be bubbling up, even overflowing. and as the music reaches a fever pitch, we run headlong into a wall. The same kind of cadenza that we heard in the first movement. We just can't overcome those barriers. Meif saw this as a reason to criticize the concerto, writing that, quote, "Even after the second movement, one feels as though he has listened to a musical prologue." For me, though, there is a powerful emotional element in this inability to go over the line. Perhaps it was the impending war. Perhaps it was something completely different. But Barber will not allow this music to ever reach full resolution. And if you thought we would get it at the end of the movement, you will be disappointed, as Barber ends the movement in a kind of uncertain stasis. One would be forgiven if they expected an epic movement to finish off this concerto, something that would resolve all of these tensions that the first two movements created. But as I've hinted at in my introduction to the show, Barber went for a completely different direction in the final movement, writing a movement that is less than 4 minutes long and which has a completely different character from everything we've heard so far. It also gives the violinist all the virtuosity it has been waiting for, and it gives them all it can handle. This movement is a perpetual motion movement, something that had never been tried before in a concerto. Meif, for his part, was, and I've been waiting to use this one, miffed, to say the least. He claimed that the violinist would be too tired to play this movement well, never mind that he also complained that the first two movements were not difficult enough, and that there wasn't enough time for the violinist to rest during the movement. The hundreds of violinists who have played this last movement, not without lots of effort, but successfully nonetheless, would seem to have proved Meif wrong. But this movement presents a challenge for everyone. The orchestra has to stay right with the soloist, as any slacking in tempo can completely disrupt the flow of what the violinist is doing. The violinist can't lose their concentration for a second, since any lapse could cause them to fall right off the track. It is a nerve-wracking moment to be sure, with surprising meter changes and confusing rhythms throughout. On my Patreon-exclusive mini-episode this week, I'll use my violin to show you what I mean in terms of those confusing rhythms. It's something that took me hours and hours to figure out when I played this concerto, so hopefully muscle memory will serve me well when I show this to you. The movement alternates between steely music and music that is much more playful. The thing is, the notes themselves aren't so difficult. There are more difficult concerti out there just in terms of pure amount of notes and etc. But it's the fact that this just doesn't stop that makes it so difficult. This movement was written after the outbreak of war in Europe, which might account for the mood change from the first two movements. But of all the criticisms of this piece, the one that I can take the most seriously is that this movement does feel separate from the first two in such a profound way that it could give the impression of being too much of a contrast. In this way, I agree with Briselli, who rejected the piece on that basis. On the other hand, I don't agree with Briselli that this minor flaw is a reason not to be a full advocate for the piece. It's just one of those small things that I think about when the movement starts, and then forget about, as I'm caught up by the brilliance of this movement. Three big moments punctuate the rest of this movement and the concerto. The first is the orchestra playing the big perpetual motion theme as the only moment of rest for the solo violinist. This gives every violinist in the orchestra a bit of a panic attack when they see it for the first time, as music that is very difficult for one violinist to play must now be played by about 30 of them. This can sometimes be a bit of a mess, but it is also a thrilling moment for the audience, like seeing 30 Olympians attempting a high jump simultaneously. Just after this comes music that is extremely playful, with the violinist playing bounding arpeggios up and down the instrument. And finally, we start heading towards the coda, one of the most thrilling in all of the concerto repertoire. Trumpet fanfares herald the violin's entrance, fighting all the way through the dense texture of the orchestra. And as the horns herald the beginning of the end, the violin suddenly begins to play faster than what seems humanly possible. Powerful slashing chords cut through the violinist's 2x speed passage work, until a cry from the orchestra, a brilliant arpeggio, and finally an A minor slam end the piece in a huff. I don't know what this movement particularly means in the context of the concerto, but it never fails to get a stunned reaction from the audience, who can't believe the challenges that the violinist has overcome. It's like running a marathon compressed into 3.5 minutes of all-out sprinting. Violinists are always completely exhausted at the end of this movement. I certainly was when I played it. Looking over the whole concerto, one can really say that it's a concerto that kind of sums up early to mid-20th century American classical music. It is full of gorgeous and yet understated melodies, yearning, melancholy, pyrotechnics, steel, tenderness, passion, and drama. In around 23 minutes of music, Barber creates an entire world for the solo violinist, the orchestra, and the audience to interact with. Now, this piece is actually still somewhat unknown in Europe, so I love performing it there. I'll never tire of seeing orchestral musicians' faces as they listen to the oboe solo in the second movement for the first time, or the sense of awe that the third movement evokes in audiences. This concerto had itself a very awkward genesis, and it has taken some criticism along the way, some warranted, but most undeserved in my opinion, and it now stands as one of the great 20th century violin concertos, and a piece that will be heard in concert halls all over the world for decades to come. Thanks so much to Glenn for sponsoring this episode today on Patreon, and thank you so much for listening to Sticky Notes today. We'll have some more exciting stuff for you in a couple of weeks, so don't miss our next episode. If you like what you heard today, please feel free to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It really helps the show gain more visibility. And please send any questions to stickynotespodcast@gmail.com or my Facebook page @StickyNotesPodcast. And if you'd like to support the podcast monetarily and perhaps sponsor a piece of your own, just head over to patreon.com/StickyNotesPodcast. Thanks, and I'll talk to you again after a while.